AM560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. The situation with the humanitarian aid to Gazans, displaced Gazans in the Middle East as war continues. The response from the Israeli government to the October 7th attack and to the existence of terrorist organizations that want to indiscriminately murder Israelis and eradicate the Jewish people and certainly the Jewish state. We talked about it quite a bit yesterday with Stephen Bucci from the Heritage Foundation, given the back and forth of accusations in the direction of the Gazan Humanitarian Foundation, which is an American project. Pushback from Johnny Moore, the executive chairman, over the weekend on Fox to the suggestion that these aid distribution centers are death traps and designed to be death traps, as a would-be whistleblower and retired Green Beret turned military contractor Tony Aguilar has been alleging on any media outlet that will have him. Started with the BBC and moved over to Tucker Carlson's show and other programs. Stephen Bucci, a bit suspect. Stephen Bucci, former special force officer himself, bit suspect of Tony Aguilar's contentions as it pertains to these humanitarian foundation aid centers, and so is Johnny Moore, the executive chairman, of course. Here's what Doctors Without Borders CEO Avril Benoit had to say on Clinton Foundation Donor Zero's weekend program about the situation there and what she believes needs to be done in the interests of preventing malnutrition, starvation primarily, and malnutrition secondarily, in addition to protecting people from the vagaries of war.
All the major orthopedic cases, the trauma, and their bodies are not strong enough to even fight, to be able to withstand the risk of infections. They're not recovering properly, and that's exacerbating the problem in the health facilities, because of course you would want people to have all the chances in the world to be able to overcome their injuries, to discharge them, to make room for others. And so as a consequence, the hospital infrastructure, which Israel has largely destroyed, with the clinics and other outpatient facilities that we have, and with the rest of the humanitarian organizations that are trying to support the medical needs in Gaza, we are completely overwhelmed, and starvation is making things all that much more catastrophic.
So what are the steps that need to be taken?
Well, I would concur with all of the experts who would say we need to flood the zone with as much food as possible. The problem with the GHF is, of course, it's unsafe. It's an inefficient way to deliver aid. People have to cross very unsafe zones to reach those areas that are controlled by the IDF and military contractors from the U.S. And then there are insufficient quantities. You end up in our facilities that are near some of those GHF distribution sites in the south. We always have lots of injuries and deaths as a consequence of every single delivery. And the injuries are not only people being shot as they're leaving the zone with their bags of flour, but it's also from the trampling that happens, the injuries that happen when people are crushing and jumbling over each other because of all the gunshots against unarmed civilians who are just trying to survive with a bit of food aid. And the problem with the airdrops, of course, is that it's incredibly expensive. You don't control what's happening on the ground, who really receives the aid. It also has created extremely insecure conditions on the ground, and you can't even drop that much. So each one of these very spectacular visual displays of the parachutes landing on the ground is really the equivalent of a few trucks. What we need is to flood the zone, get all those trucks with the permissions to go in. Obviously, a ceasefire, a real permanent lasting ceasefire, will make it safe enough for the humanitarian organizations to be able to deliver the aid to people in Gaza who desperately need it.
Well, I mean, according to Johnny Moore of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, since this is the focus of the criticism, they haven't had a single truck with aid derailed, or have had their goods in those trucks stolen by Hamas. That's what he said. Whereas the UN World Food Program has a much lower success rate in terms of delivery, like something on the order of 90% not getting there. It's a complicated picture. By the way, just as a caveat before we get to our guest, Doctors Without Borders sounds like it's not political, because these are just doctors and they're trying to take their expertise in Western medicine and bring it to people in need the world over, which is a laudable thing, but they are political. And there was a healthy dose of politics in what Dr. Benoit had to say just there. For more discussion on this, pleased to be joined by Liel Leibovitz, editor-at-large for Tablet and host of the Rootless podcast. Leo, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Pleasure as always.
So, give us your handle and the basis for it on this controversy over whether or not there's a sufficient effort being made by the combination of America and Israel to provide humanitarian aid to non-combatant Gazans.
Dan, this is really an absolutely baffling question. Let's assume for 1 second that you believe that it is the duty of any nation to provide a nation with which it is in war,
yes,
precisely a war that it did not start, with humanitarian aid. That would mean, for example, the United States stopping the war in, say, 1944 and dropping a lot of supplies on Dresden, where people were also, deeply starved during World War II. It sounds incredibly preposterous when suggested about any other nation in the world, except for some reason, Israel. Let's assume that you're saying, okay, look, I hear your point, but these people there are starving. Now, you mentioned very correctly that a very large quantity of the aid that is being permitted by Israel and by the international community to get into Gaza is simply sitting and rotting and or purloined, because the UN, as we now know, has become completely enmeshed with Hamas. Hamas has every interest in taking this aid and making sure it does not get to its own people, because Hamas understands it could never win against Israel by means of war. It could only do so if it concocts a good blood libel, a good old-fashioned anti-Semitic blood libel against the Jews, which, by the way, it did when it released a photo of a poor starving boy who was starving because of no other condition that had to do with actual geopolitics. He just had some neurological condition, and convinced every newspaper in the West that this was the face of Israeli cruelty. Let's ignore that too. It is a very simple situation. There are 58 hostages held in Gaza, people, civilians, taken from their homes, from their places of work, from a party, as we now know, and as we saw this weekend. These people are on the brink of starvation themselves. We saw a video of Eviatar David looking like an Auschwitz survivor, being forced to dig his own grave. All Hamas has to do, if it truly cares about its own people, is say, you know what, we surrender, which is, what the Nazis eventually did, what the Japanese eventually did, and let the healing of their own people begin. They refuse to do it because they don't care, Dan. All they want to do is tarnish Israel so that they could achieve their one and only goal, which is eradicating the Jewish state and the Jewish people.
You, in a recent op-ed for firstthings.com, you wrote, partisans on the left and on the right fighting bitterly for a larger swath of America's increasingly divided political landscape have now found a goal around which to unite in harmony. The Jews are our misfortune. I wish that wasn't true, but as there's some on the right that are making it more difficult to say that it isn't true. I think there's a proportionality issue, and I'll let you address that. But we had this story yesterday, the report out that the Trump administration announced that U.S. states and cities that behave like an Ivy League school and engage in a BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction proponents against Israel. BDS cities and states will be denied federal aid tied to natural disasters. Now, this was later updated to say that provision was not in any sort of executive action taken by the president. But the idea that it would be is not a crazy idea. David Reboy makes the point in a discussion on X. Boycotts of nations by individuals or private companies? Sure. Boycotts of nations by states and cities? No. We have one mechanism for foreign policy, and it's the job of the president. And he goes on in a discussion to, make the point, to those who just like, oh, Israel, 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 and even more graphic than that, as you can imagine. He goes on to say, think for a second like an adult. About how difficult it would be for a president to deal with a foreign head of state on tariffs when half of American states are already boycotting that nation's goods and so forth. Right. We have, 50 heads of states or more when you include the cities. So I guess there's two points to that. One is the reaction from some on the right to that discussion is disturbing. And some of what Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon have had to say is disturbing. But equally disturbing or more disturbing is sort of what's happened in these mediating institutions controlled by the left. What we see in New York City with, according to recent polling, a majority of Jewish voters in New York City, or at least a plurality of that cohort, supporting Zoran Mandani for mayor. And it's like, it sort of blows your mind. So I just use that as the backdrop to say, give us a more texture to the statement that the left and right has combined to say Jews are our misfortune.
Well, look, this is obviously a kind of incredibly intricate and I think very, very important discussion. And I agree with you completely that if we're looking at proportionality, the left is still, way ahead in this particular ignoble race. I think we are seeing a lot of voices like Tucker Carlson, et cetera, on the right. But the point that's being missed deliberately and maliciously, look, the point my friend David Reboy is making, I think it's an incredibly salient point. But I think there's a deeper point at play here. I'm an immigrant to this great and godly country. I believe in it and love it with all my might and want it to pursue nothing but its own interest, not the interest of any other country, including Israel, where I was born. However, there is one thing that President Trump and a few others of us understand very, very well. When the thugs are marching down the streets of New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and Boston, holding the banners of Hamas and Hezbollah, they're not really targeting the Jews. They're not really targeting Israel. They're targeting America. This is why they protest the Thanksgiving Day parade. This is why they try to disrupt the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree lighting. Their eventual goal, they're using this as a big excuse, but their eventual goal is to completely bring down all of us. And they're not too coy about this. They will tell this to you to your face. They hate America. They hate our way of life. And they finally figured out a way to kind of rot it from the inside by kind of blaming it on the Jews. Trump understands this very, very well. He wants to stop and act this. Actors like Tucker, he wants to act rather and stop this. But actors like Tucker Carlson are, pretending like, oh, no, this is about America. Oh, no, we're only asking questions. While Tucker Carlson has on, the prime minister of Iran, while he travels to Russia, while he kind of sits there and cozies up to the emir of Qatar. These are all American foes. There could be no mistake where American interests lies. American interests lie in curbing any terror organization, group, and state actor that wants to imperil American interests at home and abroad.
Yeah, and the flip side, of course, to all of this is Speaker Johnson at the Wailing Wall the other day talking about the the special relationship with Israel and the Jewish people, and sort of recommitting from his perspective and that of his caucus to that relationship, where I don't think you're going to get Hakeem Jeffries in front of the Wailing Wall saying anything like that anytime soon.
No, I believe that is correct. Look, I think the Democratic Party has lost the thread a very, very long time ago. I mean, it lost the thread on so many things, like trying to ascertain successfully, who is or what is a woman. But they certainly lost the thread when it comes to geopolitics and basic human morality, which is why more and more of them side was come out. I think in the Republican Party, there is still a large swath of lawmakers, and I hope and believe a larger swath of voters who understands very well that when we talk about, we stand with Israel, we're not talking about some, magical, inexplicable bond, nor are we even talking just solely about something that has deep, profound religious foundation. We're basically talking about straightforward American interests in an all-important region with one ally that could be trusted to basically serve as a kind of a stronghold for protecting a host of American interests so that America does not have to get involved in regional conflict. That, I think, worldview that used to be common practice on the right, sadly, is now being challenged by some sort of opportunistic actors who see kind of an in to sort of flank the mainstream establishment from the left. I hope that voters will soundly reject this. But again, I think the person who understands the big picture better than anyone is President Trump. And I can only hope that whoever succeeds him as the leader of the Republican Party manages to preserve the same wisdom as him.
Now, in a piece in the outlet where you are editor-at-large, Tablet, the investigative journalist Lee Smith, who's always does good work, I've cited his stories quite a bit, has a really interesting and simultaneously disturbing angle on some of this as it pertains to Tucker and Bannon. His piece is entitled Epstein Gate is Russiagate 2.0. And what he essentially argues is that Trump is right in a sense that Epstein is a hoax that is being perpetrated by the Russiagate perpetrators in order to distract attention away from what they did. And Bannon and Tucker Carlson, by raising the specter of Epstein as a Mossad agent, is actually doing the work of the Russiagate collaborators and undermining MAGA by extension. He also offers this. Bannon appears to be the originator of the Epstein as spy theory. After Trump's one-time strategist was pushed out of the White House in 2017, he started meeting with Epstein at his Manhattan mansion, and reportedly, according to people close to him, he thought his host worked with intelligence services. He recorded 15 hours of interviews with the financier, ostensibly to be used in helping to rehabilitate Epstein's reputation. Wow. I mean, that alone. But let me go on. That Bannon hasn't yet released that footage suggests it contains no evidence to corroborate his allegations. Maybe he's embarrassed that he spent 15 hours interviewing Epstein and forgot to ask the man how he says he was part of a Mossad spy ring if he was a spy. Or maybe he didn't ask him because he never believed what he's been telling people about Epstein since 2017. I mean, that's pretty explosive stuff.
I think you said it right there. I mean, I think Lee's completely correct. And I think once you look at it, it's not just explosive. It's just head-scratching, because the deeper you dig into this, the more you see nothing but malice on behalf of these actors who I think feel spurned by President Trump, feel sort of rejected and maybe removed from the power they hoped they would have during the second term, and therefore are doing whatever they can to undermine the president, to undermine MAGA, and more kind of acutely to undermine basic American interests by inventing this absolutely preposterous hoax that this man, Jeffrey Epstein, who was guilty of many things, many heinous things, was somehow not only just a sexual predator who sort of preyed on young women and sort of pinned them out to some powerful men, but actually a super spy operating on behalf of the nefarious Jewish state that used him as a tool to sort of have its tentacles into American politics. If you read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that fabricated bit of anti-Semitic vile propaganda released in Russia in the 19th century, it reads almost identical to what Bannon and Tucker Carlson are saying right now. It's just, an English-American version of the same ancient canard. Again, luckily, now we have better ways to actually come up with real information, real facts, and rebut this thing, and remind ourselves what's really at stake when we get distracted by these preposterous stories.
Liel Leibovitz is editor-at-large for Tablet at tabletmag.com. He's also the host of the Rootless podcast. Liel, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate your time.
A pleasure. Thank you so much.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
You need a construction company, but who?
Call Croscom.
A construction company you can trust that shares your Christian and conservative values. For decades, Croscom has been doing work in Chicagoland, Northwest Indiana, and Wisconsin. Roofs, siding, windows, doors, gutters, basically everything.